Melissa Joan Hart and Nate Richert defined true love for a generation, but off-screen greedy network executives treated Nate like a disposable prop. While Melissa was their multi-million-dollar star, they coldly fired Nate over a phone call for lacking an edgy appeal, and when Melissa and furious fans forced them to rehire him, the studio exacted a cruel revenge. They punished him with a humiliating contract, eventually leaving America's teenage prince to battle severe anxiety and clean toilets just to survive? To the television network sitting in Los Angeles boardrooms, Sabrina and Harvey were not a love story. They were highly calibrated demographic tools. When that machinery required a new demographic to sell more expensive commercials, the executives ruthlessly dismantled the lives of the actors involved. They forced Melissa Joan Hart into a psychological torture chamber and coldly disposed of Nate Richert. But how did a show built on pure innocent magic become a psychological prison? The blueprint for this corporate brutality wasn't drafted overnight. It began the moment the golden cage was first constructed around them. The year was 1996. The American television landscape was dominated by network broadcasting, and the undisputed king of family programming was ABC's TGIF, Friday Night Lineup. It was a cultural institution that guaranteed tens of millions of captive viewers. At the center of this highly profitable block, the network launched Sabrina, the Teenage Witch. The program was not a risky, independent, artistic endeavor. It was a massive, pre-existing commercial property anchored by the notoriously protective copyright holders at Archie Comics. The comic book publisher had owned the character for decades, and they viewed the television show merely as a lucrative extension of their licensing empire. When Melissa Joan Hart was cast in the title role, she was barely 20 years old. She had already survived the grueling pressure of childhood stardom on the Nickelodeon network, but the demands of leading a primetime network sitcom were of a completely different, terrifying magnitude. She was not treated as a young woman stepping into adulthood. She was immediately converted into the central pillar of a billion-dollar brand. The physical requirements of anchoring the production were punishing. Because the show relied heavily on complex practical effects, from an animatronic cat that constantly broke down to elaborate wirework magic tricks, the filming process was incredibly slow and tedious. Melissa was in nearly every single scene. She regularly endured exhausting 16-hour workdays, forced to memorize pages of rapidly changing dialogue overnight, only to stand under sweltering studio lights and deliver light-hearted comedy on a severe sleep deficit. But the physical exhaustion was only a fraction of the burden. The true toll was the suffocating psychological pressure of maintaining a flawless, squeaky clean image. Melissa was a corporate product. The entire financial ecosystem of the show, the network advertising rates, the international syndication deals, the lunch boxes, and the comic book sales, relied entirely on her projecting absolute moral perfection. She was legally and contractually bound to the morality of a fictional teenager. Any deviation from the wholesome American archetype, any normal 20-year-old mistake caught by the paparazzi, threatened to collapse a corporate empire. She was forced to police her own behavior, her own speech, and her own private life with a terrifying hypervigilance, knowing that hundreds of adult crew members and executives depended on her pristine reputation for their paychecks. To counterbalance the magical absurdity of the show and ground it in a relatable reality, the producers cast Nate Richert as Harvey Kinkle. He was the quintessential high school boy next door, sweet, slightly oblivious, and entirely dependable. the genuine, unforced on-screen chemistry between. And Melissa and Nate was the vital element that made the artificial premise of the show actually work. They provided the emotional heartbeat that kept the audience returning week after week. However, the network executives did not view this chemistry as a collaborative artistic achievement. To the men analyzing the viewership data, Nate was simply a demographic anchor. He was employed specifically to capture and hold the adolescent female viewership. He was the accessory used to make Melissa's character relatable to Middle America. For the first 3 years of the production, this formula worked flawlessly. The show became a global juggernaut, generating staggering wealth for the ABC network and Archie Comics. During these early years, a false sense of security settled over the set. The actors formed close bonds, functioning under the illusion that they were a television family. But this is the most insidious deception of the entertainment industry. The system deliberately fosters a familial atmosphere on set to ensure maximum compliance and long working hours, masking the cold, ruthless corporate reality operating just above their heads. Nate Richert arrived at the studio every day, hit his marks, and delivered the charming performance that anchored the show's demographic success, completely unaware of how entirely disposable he was to the men who signed his checks. The industry in the late 1990s operated under a draconian financial structure. Unlike modern television, where leading actors often secure executive producer credits and ownership stakes in their shows, the actors of the 90s sitcom machine were merely salaried employees. Neither Melissa nor Nate owned the underlying rights to the characters they were making globally famous. They were creating a permanent cultural footprint, but they were building an empire on rented land. The machine was actively extracting their youth, capitalizing on their natural chemistry, and hoarding the overwhelming majority of the long-term profits. By 1999, the characters were preparing to graduate from high school, and the television network was looking at the future of the series. Television is a relentless, cannibalistic business that demands constant, aggressive growth. Maintaining a steady audience is never enough. The executives required a more lucrative demographic. The teenage girls who had propelled the show to success were no longer the target market. The network wanted to age the show up. They wanted to capture the highly coveted, college-aged, 18 to 49 demographic, because advertisers paid a massive premium to reach young adults with disposable income. This boardroom decision, based entirely on advertising algorithms and profit margins, was about to trigger a catastrophic chain reaction on the studio floor. The executives decided that the wholesome, innocent tone that had built the billion-dollar brand was suddenly a liability. They demanded that the show become edgier, darker, and significantly more provocative. For Melissa Joan Hart, this corporate mandate was the beginning of a psychological nightmare. She was a young woman who had spent 4 years being fiercely punished for any display of mature sexuality, conditioned to protect her innocent image at all costs. Now, the very executives who had built her golden cage were demanding she break out of it to secure their ratings. But the cage was not theirs to unlock. The character of Sabrina was still legally owned by the deeply conservative publishers at Archie Comics, who had absolutely no intention of letting their pristine property be cheapened for network profit. Melissa was about to be caught in the crossfire of a brutal corporate war, trapped between a network demanding she shed her clothes for ratings and a copyright holder threatening to destroy her life if she did. Meanwhile, The demographic algorithm that demanded this mature shift turned its cold, calculating gaze toward Nate Richert. The executives looked at the innocent, dependable Harvey Kinkle and decided his utility had expired. The illusion of the television family was about to be violently shattered, and the true, bloodless nature of the Hollywood machine was preparing to reveal itself. In 1999, the impending transition of the characters from high school to college aligned with a massive corporate upheaval that would permanently alter the trajectory of everyone involved. The ABC network was beginning to dismantle its family-friendly Friday night lineup, and the broadcasting rights for Sabrina the Teenage Witch were acquired by the WB network. The WB was an entirely different industrial beast. It was the home of highly sensationalized, angst-ridden teen dramas, a network that built its brand on the brooding, adult-themed problems of highly attractive young people. The executives at the WB looked at the pastel-colored, innocent world of Sabrina Spellman and demanded an immediate, aggressive rebranding. They needed to sell advertising space to companies targeting young adults, and those specific advertisers demanded mature allure. Melissa Joan Hart was 23 years old, exhausted from carrying a billion-dollar franchise, and suddenly faced with an impossible corporate ultimatum. The network effectively communicated that if she did not shed her wholesome, childlike image, the show would die and hundreds of people would lose their jobs. She was heavily pressured by the industry machinery to prove she could be a mature, desirable leading lady. In the autumn of 1999, to promote an upcoming feature film and simultaneously satisfy this new, unspoken industry demand for maturity, she agreed to pose for the cover of Maxim, a highly popular men's magazine. The photographs were standard for the era, suggestive but far from explicit. However, the magazine editors slapped a provocative headline on the cover, explicitly using her character's name to sell copies. The reaction from the corporate copyright holders was swift, ferocious, and entirely hypocritical. Archie Comics, the deeply conservative publishing company that legally owned the Sabrina property, did not care about the WB's demographic algorithms or their advertising rates. They cared strictly about their comic book sales in primary schools. When the magazine hit the newsstands, the publishers erupted. They immediately contacted Melissa's legal team, threatening to fire her from her own show and sue her for catastrophic financial damages, citing a strict morality clause buried deep within her contract. This is the specific psychological torture chamber built for young women in the entertainment industry. The system demands that an actress objectify herself to remain relevant and profitable for the television network. But the absolute moment she complies, the conservative copyright holders threaten to bankrupt her for tarnishing the family brand. It is a calculated, unwinnable double bind designed to keep the performer in a state of permanent fear and submission. Melissa was forced into a deeply humiliating position, groveling to the executives and issuing public apologies to appease the men who had essentially engineered the entire crisis. She was left terrified, acutely aware that she possessed no actual power over her own body, her image, or her career. She was a highly paid hostage to a comic book company, threatened with absolute ruin for simply attempting to navigate the contradictory demands of her employers. While Melissa was busy fighting off multi-million-dollar lawsuits to save her career, the demographic algorithm swung its scythe toward Nate Richert. For the executives at the WB, the transition to the college years required a complete merciless purge of the high school innocence that had defined the ABC era. They looked at the character of Harvey Kinkle and saw a relic of a past demographic. He was sweet, genuinely funny, and entirely devoted to the protagonist. To the network board members, this TT ran slated to boring. They wanted Sabrina to date brooding musicians, sophisticated teaching assistants, and edgy, unpredictable older men. They believed, based entirely on cold market research, that this manufactured drama would attract the lucrative 18 to 34 female demographic. Nate Richert had spent 4 years of his life helping to build a global phenomenon. He had worked the same punishing hours, hit the same marks, and provided the crucial grounding chemistry that made the absurd magical premise of the show actually function. But the Hollywood machine does not reward loyalty, nor does it respect artistic chemistry. It only rewards immediate demographic utility. When the 4th season concluded in the spring of 2000, Nate was not invited into a boardroom for a respectful face-to-face conversation about the creative direction of the program. He was not given a final celebratory episode to wrap up his character's arc, nor was he thanked for generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. He was fired over a brief cold telephone call. The absolute brutality of this dismissal cannot be overstated. Terminating a central cast member over the phone is a deliberate, cowardly corporate tactic. It avoids the uncomfortable human reality of looking a young man in the eye and telling him he is no longer wanted. It reduces a human being to the status of a canceled vendor contract. For Nate, the psychological impact was devastating. Actors, by the very nature of their profession, must commodify their own personalities and physical appearances. When a network executive fires an actor specifically because the character is no longer deemed sexy or edgy enough for a mature audience, it is impossible for the actor not to internalize that rejection. Nate did not just lose his employment. He was explicitly told by the industry that he, as a man, was fundamentally inadequate. The system had extracted his youth, capitalized on his boyish charm, and then discarded him the absolute second he no longer fit their market research. This cold-blooded corporate severance completely shattered the illusion of the television family. It proved to every single crew member and actor on the set that they were entirely expendable, subject to execution at the whim of a spreadsheet. The trauma of this abrupt dismissal extended heavily to Melissa. She had just survived a brutal, terrifying legal threat from her own copyright holders, and now she was returning to work stripped of her most trusted colleague and emotional anchor. The safe, collaborative environment they had built together was permanently destroyed. As the 5th season commenced on the new network, the working environment transformed into an isolating, alienating grind. The network executives, supremely confident in their demographic algorithms, brought in a revolving door of generic, conventionally muscular male actors to serve as Sabrina's new college love interests. But television chemistry cannot be manufactured in a boardroom, and audiences are rarely as stupid as executives believe them to be. Melissa had zero natural rapport with these studio-mandated boyfriends. The romantic storylines felt forced, deeply artificial, and entirely devoid of the warmth that had originally made the show a global success. Melissa found herself profoundly isolated on her own set. She was carrying the crushing weight of a transitioning television program entirely on her own shoulders. She was surrounded by network executives demanding higher ratings, producers terrified of upsetting Archie comics, and a parade of unfamiliar guest actors treating her set as a temporary stepping stone. Every single day, She had to stand under the bright studio lights, fake romantic sparks with complete strangers, and pretend that the magical world of Sabrina Spellman was still intact. She had to project joy and lighthearted comedy while knowing that the corporate machine had just coldly executed her best friend and threatened to ruin her own life. The magic was entirely gone. Only the brutal, grinding reality of the Hollywood contract remained, and the executives were about to discover that their cynical gamble to manipulate the audience was about to fail spectacularly. The autumn of 2000 brought the premiere of the 5th season, and with it, the brutal vindication of human chemistry over corporate mathematics. The executives at the WB network had confidently engineered what they believed was a highly profitable reboot. They had purged the high school innocence, disposed of Nate Richert, and surrounded Melissa Joan Hart with a cast of conventionally attractive, heavily styled older actors. They expected a massive surge in the lucrative 18 to 34 demographic. Instead, they experienced a catastrophic mass exodus. The viewing public, who had invested 4 years of emotional capital into the specific, genuine dynamic between Sabrina and Harvey, looked at the network's manufactured, edgy replacements and completely rejected them. Ratings plummeted. The fans did not write angry letters. They simply turned off their televisions. This immediate, devastating drop in viewership exposes the fundamental flaw at the core of the entertainment industry. Television executives frequently rely on spreadsheets, market research, and demographic algorithms to dictate creative decisions. But an algorithm cannot quantify human warmth. It cannot measure the subtle, unscripted timing between two actors who genuinely trust one another. The network had treated the audience like a mindless consumer base that would automatically accept whatever attractive face was placed on the screen. The viewers proved them wrong, heavily penalizing the network for breaking the emotional contract of the program. The studio-mandated boyfriends were perceived exactly as they were: cheap, corporate interpolations, entirely lacking in substance. As the ratings continued to crater throughout the 5th season, blind panic set into the corporate boardrooms. In television production, declining viewership does not merely hurt egos, it immediately triggers a terrifying financial chain reaction. Advertising rates drop. The guaranteed syndication value of future seasons is severely threatened. The executives who had coldly executed the character of Harvey Kinkle just months prior were suddenly staring at the premature death of $1 billion property. This panic lays bare the ultimate truth of the Hollywood machine. It is entirely impervious to artistic arguments or basic human decency, but it will immediately capitulate to the threat of financial loss. Down on the soundstage, Melissa watched the executives scramble. She was physically exhausted and psychologically battered from the previous year's legal threats regarding the magazine cover. She was working grueling hours on a set that felt increasingly hollow. But she was also highly intelligent, and she recognized the shift in the power dynamic. The men in suits who had bullied her and dictated her image were suddenly terrified of losing their bonuses. She understood her leverage. Without her face on the screen, the entire corporate enterprise ceased to exist immediately. She decided to use that leverage to fight the machine. Melissa refused to let the program die a slow, embarrassing death dictated by bad executive decisions. She broke rank and initiated a direct confrontation with the network brass. She marched into the production offices and explicitly demanded the reinstatement of Nate Richert. She told the producers that their algorithm was wrong, that their new direction was alienating the core fan base, and that the only way to salvage the ratings was to repair the damage they had inflicted on the narrative. The psychological weight of this rebellion was immense. The entertainment industry in the early 2000s was heavily dominated by a deeply entrenched patriarchal power structure. Actresses in their early 20s were expected to smile, hit their marks, and remain entirely compliant. For a 24-year-old woman to sit across a mahogany table from wealthy, powerful male executives and tell them their multi-million-dollar strategy was a failure required an extraordinary reserve of courage. She had to risk being labeled difficult or uncooperative, labels that have historically been weaponized to permanently destroy the careers of young women in Hollywood. She put her own hard-won professional standing on the line, going to war with her bosses not for a pay rise, but to protect the artistic integrity of the story and to rescue her discarded co-star from corporate erasure. Backed into a corner by plummeting advertising revenues and a defiant lead star, the network executives were forced to concede. They looked at the declining spreadsheets and agreed to bring Nate Richert back to the program. But corporate ego does not concede defeat without exacting a heavy toll. The executives were furious that they had been proven wrong by their audience and strong-armed by their actress. They were legally required to reinstate the character to save their profits, but they were determined to punish the actor who played him. They prepared a new contract for Nate, and it was a document stripped of any professional respect. They did not invite him back as a series regular. They did not offer him the salary or the status he had earned over his initial 4 years of service. Instead, they orchestrated a petty, calculated humiliation. They demoted him to the status of a recurring guest star. They deliberately slashed his guaranteed screen time, ensuring he would only appear sporadically, and they brutally cut his salary in half. The network executives essentially built a trap. They knew Nate was a working actor who needed the income. They knew the audience demanded his return, so they offered him his job back, but under terms designed to remind him every single day that he was CIZ, unsidered, fundamentally inferior, and entirely disposable. They were forcing a young man to choose between his financial survival and his professional dignity, preparing to subject both halves of television's favorite couple to a new, highly toxic phase of psychological endurance. When the revised contract arrived on Nate Richert's desk, it was not an olive branch. It was a documented act of corporate hostility. He was handed a piece of paper that explicitly stated his value had been slashed in half. The psychological cruelty of this moment is profound. Nate was a working actor in his early 20s. He had spent his most formative years playing Harvey Kinkle, which meant he was already heavily typecast in the industry. The casting directors at other networks were not offering him gritty, dramatic roles. They only saw him as the boy from the teenage witch show. His options were severely limited. He needed the income to survive in Los Angeles. The network executives knew exactly how little leverage he possessed, and they exploited his financial vulnerability to force him into submission. Nate signed the degraded contract. He swallowed his pride, walked back through the studio gates, and returned to the very soundstage where he had been deemed worthless just months prior. The atmosphere on the set immediately morphed into an exercise in high-stakes psychological endurance. For the crew and the fans, Harvey Kinkle was back. But for Nate and Melissa, the reality was deeply toxic. Every time Nate stepped in front of the camera, he had to perform under the watchful, resentful eyes of the producers and executives who had explicitly tried to erase him. He was forced to project the charming, carefree innocence of a young man in love, knowing perfectly well that the men signing his reduced paychecks viewed him with absolute contempt. He was effectively paying a financial and emotional penalty for his own popularity. The shared trauma of this dynamic heavily impacted Melissa. She had successfully fought the network to bring her friend back, but her victory was hollowed out by the petty revenge the executives had extracted. She had to stand on her own set and watch her trusted co-star be systematically disrespected by the system she was anchoring. The cognitive dissonance required to survive this environment was staggering. When the director called action, Melissa and Nate were required to look into each other's eyes and act out a magical, deeply romantic rekindling of television's favorite couple. The moment the director called cut, they snapped back into a hostile corporate reality where they were both heavily exploited, overworked, and constantly monitored by a paranoid network. They were selling the illusion of pure love to millions of viewers while silently drowning in corporate cynicism. They endured this punishing routine for 2 more years. By the spring of 2003, the television landscape had shifted entirely, and the network decided to pull the plug. Sabrina the Teenage Witch came to an end after 7 seasons and exactly 163 episodes. The series finale was deliberately crafted to give the audience exactly what they demanded, the ultimate fairy tale conclusion. In the final scene, Sabrina leaves a wealthy, sophisticated groom at the altar, runs out of a church, and rides off into the distance on the back of Harvey Kinkle's motorcycle. The fans were thrilled. The demographic algorithm had ultimately failed, and true love had won the narrative. But television endings are illusions, and the reality that followed the final cut was a masterclass in legalized financial robbery. As the actors cleared out their dressing rooms and prepared to face an uncertain future, the executives sitting in the network boardrooms initiated the most lucrative phase of the entire enterprise. They packaged those 163 episodes and sold them into global syndication. The program was broadcast in dozens of CEI countries, translated into multiple languages, and rerun endlessly on cable networks. This syndication generated an astronomical river of revenue. Hundreds of millions of dollars began flowing directly into the bank accounts of the ABC network, the WB network, and the copyright holders at Archie Comics. These royalty checks would arrive continuously, reliably, for the rest of their lives. The actors who built that success were entirely locked out of the vault. To understand the sheer scale of this exploitation, one must understand the standard structure of 1990s television contracts. The industry was designed to protect the intellectual property owners above all else. Neither Melissa Joan Hart, who carried the crushing physical and legal burden of the franchise, nor Nate Richert, who provided the crucial demographic anchor, owned a single percentage of the underlying rights to the show. They were the undeniable, globally recognized faces of a billion-dollar phenomenon. But legally, they were treated as temporary contract workers. They did not possess the specific, highly lucrative profit-sharing contracts that modern television stars routinely negotiate today. They were granted standard union-mandated residual checks. In the television industry, these residuals diminish rapidly over time, eventually shrinking to mere pennies per airing. The corporate machine had executed its primary function flawlessly. It had extracted their youth, capitalized on their natural chemistry, weaponized their personal lives for ratings, and then hoarded the overwhelming majority of the permanent financial rewards. When the studio gates locked behind them in 2003, Melissa and Nate were suddenly untethered from the machine. that had defined their adult lives. They stepped out into the harsh sunlight of the Los Angeles entertainment industry, carrying the heavy, invisible scars of a 7-year psychological war. The network had secured its global syndication fortune, leaving the two young stars to deal with the devastating biological and mental fallout of their employment. They were about to discover that surviving a massive television hit is often far more difficult than securing one, and the long-term cost of being America's favorite teenage couple was about to come due. When the heavy studio doors closed for the final time in the spring of 2003, the sudden silence was deafening. For 7 years, the lives of Melissa Joan Hart and Nate Richert had been entirely dictated by production schedules, wardrobe fittings, demographic algorithms, and the relentless demands of network executives. They had existed in a state of permanent high-frequency adrenaline. But when a television program ceases production, the Hollywood machine does not offer a decompression period for its human assets. The infrastructure vanishes overnight. The actors are simply unplugged from the matrix and released into the world. It is in this abrupt, jarring silence that the true biological and psychological toll of the entertainment industry finally manifests. For Melissa Joan Hart, the immediate aftermath was characterized by profound systemic burnout. She was 27 years old, but her nervous system had endured the mileage of a corporate litigator twice her age. She had spent the entirety of her youth and early 20s operating under a terrifying state of hypervigilance. She had carried the crushing physical workload of leading a network sitcom, but she had also fought a grueling psychological war. She had navigated the manipulative politics of television executives, survived the devastating legal threats from Archie Comics over her public image, and risked her own career to save her co-star from erasure. The human body is not designed to sustain that level of chronic stress indefinitely. When the show ended, the adrenaline that had kept her functioning evaporated, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She had to undergo the complex, painful process of unty, angling her own identity from the corporate property she had inhabited for a decade. She possessed the financial security to step back, but she had to fundamentally rebuild her psychological architecture. She had to learn how to exist as an adult woman who was no longer contractually obligated to be perfect, no longer required to smile for the cameras while executives threatened her livelihood. She survived the machine, but the survival required a massive expenditure of her youth. For Nate Richert, however, the descent was far more rapid and infinitely more devastating. He did not possess the financial buffer or the industry leverage of a leading star. He carried the specific lingering trauma of a man who had been explicitly told by his industry that he was fundamentally inadequate. The network executives had not just fired him, they had humiliated him. They had weaponized his financial vulnerability to force him into a degraded contract, requiring him to spend his final years on the show working for half his value in an environment of thinly veiled corporate contempt. This sustained psychological abuse triggered a severe collapse in his mental health. Following the conclusion of the series, Nate was consumed by profound clinical depression and crippling anxiety. The mechanism of this collapse is deeply logical when viewed through the lens of trauma. He had been beamed into millions of homes across the globe. He had received sacks of fan mail and had his face printed on the covers of international magazines. Yet, the people who actually controlled his life, the executives in the boardroom, had treated him like disposable garbage. The human mind cannot easily reconcile the massive cognitive dissonance between global public adoration and explicit corporate worthlessness. The contradiction eventually shatters the ego. As the years progressed, the financial reality of his situation became acute. The meager, diminishing residual checks from his television work were entire. Eli insufficient to sustain a life in California. He was a globally recognized television star, but he was broke. He attempted to secure new acting roles, but the industry operates heavily on visual association. Casting directors could only see Harvey Kinkle. He was entirely typecast, blocked from transitioning into mature dramatic roles by the very network that had fired him for not being mature enough. Faced with a rapidly depleting bank account and a toxic industry that offered no salvation, Nate Richert made a decision of absolute unvarnished pragmatism. He left Hollywood. He completely severed ties with the entertainment machine that had broken him, prioritizing his basic survival and his mental health over the hollow pursuit of fame. To pay his rent, purchase his groceries, and fund his medical care, the former teen idol entered the civilian workforce. He took on grinding physical manual labor. He worked as a carpenter, framing houses and swinging a hammer. He worked as a property maintenance man. Eventually, he took a job as a janitor. There is a stark, almost surreal visual contrast in this reality. The man who had anchored a billion-dollar television franchise, the actor whose televised kisses had generated massive advertising revenue for the ABC and WB networks, was now wearing a uniform and plunging toilets. He was mopping floors to survive. While the network executives who had slashed his salary were utilizing the massive syndication profits from his episodes to purchase luxury real estate and fund their retirements, the man whose face was actually on the screen was cleaning up other people's filth just to make ends meet. When the tabloid media eventually discovered his new profession, they attempted to frame it as a tragic, embarrassing fall from grace. They published articles highlighting the shocking disparity between his television past and his janitorial present, utilizing his financial struggles for cheap internet traffic. But framing honest annual labor as an embarrassment is a failure of perspective. There is absolute dignity in a man working with his hands to pay his bills and manage his severe depression. The embarrassment does not belong to the janitor holding the mop. The profound, undeniable shame belongs entirely to the multi-billion-dollar television industry that extracted his youth, profited off his talent, and then discarded him into poverty the moment his demographic utility expired. Nate Richert did not fail. The system functioned exactly as it was designed to. Today, the cultural footprint of Sabrina the Teenage Witch remains massive. The series is continuously discovered by new generations on streaming platforms. When audiences watch the program, they are immediately transported back to a simpler era. They watch Sabrina and Harvey and they feel a deep, comforting nostalgia. The show remains a safe space, a magical sanctuary insulated from the complexities of the real world. But as viewers, we must actively confront the reality of how that comfort was manufactured. We cannot separate the art from the highly predatory conditions of its creation. The beautiful, uncomplicated romance that defines 1990s television was a meticulously constructed illusion built upon a foundation of corporate ruthlessness. The story of Melissa Joan Hart and Nate Richert is not a fairy tale. It is a permanent, damning indictment of a capitalist entertainment system that views human beings strictly as depreciating assets. The industry demanded absolute perfection from a young woman, threatening her with legal ruin to maintain their profit margins. It coldly executed the career of a young man based on a demographic algorithm, plunging him into a psychological abyss and abandoning him to clean toilets while they hoarded the wealth his face generated. We must recognize that the brightest, most beloved memories of our television history are frequently purchased with the mental health, dignity, and the sanity of the people forced to perform them. The Hollywood machine is a factory that manufactures joy for the masses, but behind the brightly lit sound stages, the gears of that factory are lubricated by the systematic destruction of the very actors who bring the magic to life.